Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started with the closing panel. A couple of announcements first, or I guess one announcement in particular first. We do have lunch coming afterwards, a pizza lunch as part of a salon that's going to take place in this room. It's a conversation among largely self-identifying conservatives about the appropriate relationship between government and corporations and what role money should play in our elections. So you're all welcome to stay for that. And here's our closing panel. Some familiar faces, some new. Mark Meckler, who you've met. Art Wittich, who is a Montana state senator who got an application resolution through the Montana Assembly this year. Chris Blazajewski, who's a state representative from Rhode Island. Professor Richard Parker of Harvard Law. Derek Kressman of Common Cause. Lawrence Lessig, and Eric Byler, a co-founder of the Coffee Party. And with that, I will hand it off to our moderator.
Hi, I'm Richard Parker. Let me just tell you how we're going to proceed. The ground rules are that each panelist will speak around 4 minutes, no more than 5 certainly, and I at the end will say a little bit of my 4 minutes worth, and we'll go in the following order, which is meant to provide some variety. Just call people by their first names. I hope that's all right. First, Chris, then Derek, then Art, then Eric, then Mark, and then Larry, and finally I'll say something. Then I will ask the panel members to say something, hopefully something critical to stir things up about what someone else has said, and then of course everybody else in the room, we hope will pitch in again with more critical statements, the better. So we'll start right now with Chris.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for having me here. I think it would be helpful to tell you a little bit about myself and where I'm coming from, and then secondly, what I think I've learned through this process, and then finally, a few words on where I think things could be going. First, so yes, I'm a state representative from Rhode Island. In fact, I have the seat that former state rep and congressional candidate David Siegel had. Just so you understand sort of the demographics there, it is a district that surrounds Brown University and is in downtown Providence. It has many students and professionals, but also working class people and blue-collar workers. There are folks in public housing, so it's varied, but for the most part it's a blue district in a blue state. And I can tell you that knocking on doors while I was running for office, and I'm very curious to hear your perspective too on this. The things that I heard were not, we need to change the Constitution. I mean, I can promise you that I never heard a constituent say that. What I did hear are that voters in my district are concerned about, you know, a good job, a good education for their children, affordable and quality health care, a clean environment and clean water. Those are the issues that are important to them. And frankly, those are the issues that are important to me. And I think that part of the challenge for organizing for a constitutional convention on the national level is going to be the challenge of translating what are concrete and important values, day-to-day values for working men and women in our country, and how an amendment to a founding document 300 years ago is relevant to those day-to-day important issues that people face. And I think one of the things I've learned is that I think one of the a nexus for this is the connection between money and politics and the corrupting influence that has on the ability of our government to function to assist and allow for private ventures to provide for just the things that people are looking for. And so I think that that's very important. You know, another thing I've learned through this conference is the connection between values of the left and right. I think there are a few that I've noticed revolving around free speech, both traditional speech and the written word, but not just the written word in paper form, but also the internet. And I know David Siegel's been working hard on that. I think there's other people in this room who have been working hard on that, making sure that we have a free and open internet. I think it's important to, I'd say, virtually everyone in this room. I'd say another thing is the centralization of power that is the result of increasing lobbying efforts in our Congress. It seems to be a connection in the impact of the deleterious impact of money on politics. And finally, I think that we all think that our nation's economy is struggling right now, and there's big disagreement as to how we can solve that. But I think that part of the issue is going to have to come up with having an amendment process to our Constitution that is more usable. And I'll just make one more comment. I'm getting the stop signal. I'll make one more comment. I think one of the big challenges is the way that the amendment process is currently structured. I think that's a huge issue. I think that Congress essentially has a veto, and it's not surprising that there hasn't been a constitutional convention and under our current Constitution based on that. And finally, that the only example that we have of a constitutional convention which predates ours, the Article of Confederation, was in fact a runaway convention. So we have to be clear about how we were to structure resolutions around our country to focus on the issues that are important to us and all the issues that could come along with starting that process. And I look forward to answering any questions. Thank you.
I'm Derek Cressman with Common Cause, and want to first thank Larry and Mark for pulling this amazing event together. Larry, I think your reframing of the problem of money in politics away from this narrow quid pro quo problem to this much more systemic corruption of accountability to we the people is an incredibly important contribution. Mark, I think your presence here and thoughtful dialogue of you and your colleagues has gone a long way to debunk the really unfair stereotype of many on the left of the Tea Party, of people who are not willing to engage in that debate. So thank you. I want to start with a 30-second story that you'll see why it's relevant in a second, but it's about two guys who go moose hunting in remote Maine, I think it was. And to get there, they take a plane that lands on a lake, and they go out and they each get a moose. They come back. The pilot looks at them and says, guys, I can't get you out of here. It's too heavy. We can't strap two mooses to my plane and be able to take off. Maybe if you want to get them out, there's a river there, build a raft, float them out. They say, no way, that river's uncharted. There are rocks, there are sandbars, we don't even know where it goes, it might lead us to Canada. Too scary, take us on the plane. We've done this before, trust us. The pilot's convinced, they get on the plane, they take off, they make it about 500 feet, they're going up, 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 crashes, boom, they're in the lake. And the first hunter, gets up, he's got his life raft and looks back and goes, well, it's a lot farther than we made it last time. And I tell that, Richard, because I was here in Austin Hall 11 years ago with Richard Parker when I was with a different organization and representatives from Common Cause and others. And I was making the case that we needed a constitutional amendment then to overturn Buckley v. Vallejo and Bellotti, which ruled that corporations are people and have speech in ballot measure campaigns. And I didn't get very far. Some of the brilliant lawyers in the rooms wanted to play ping pong at the Supreme Court and go, well, we lost then, but we can win now. Let's go back with another case. Others from Common Cause said, we don't need a constitutional amendment. We're going to get McCain-Feingold. We can get public financing. It's all good. That's a distraction from the immediate cause. Well, in the last 11 years, we have come a lot farther. And at the risk of being the butt of my own joke, I'm going to make the case that we still need to pursue a traditional path of a constitutional amendment to deal with these money and politics problems. And that's, in essence, what I figured out back then, 11 years ago, was while I failed to persuade people that the most helpful thing I could do was to speed them along in their processes. So I got behind the effort to challenge Buckley in the courts. I got behind McCain-Feingold. I got behind efforts to pass public financing. And I would ask the proponents of a convention to get behind a traditional approach to an amendment, not exclusively, but in addition to your work, because I think there are many people in the country who feel like we have not exhausted our opportunities there, and that until they get to that point, they're not going to be ready to look at something else. And I actually have increasingly become to believe it is possible to win an amendment through traditional means. Senator Hollings and Specter pursued this for years in the US Senate, and the most recent vote that they had about 10 years ago, there were 40 US senators of both parties who voted for that, with zero lobbying campaign, zero endorsements from any major reform organization, nothing. I think that's a pretty good place to start. I think we can get up from there. And I see that I'm out of time, so I'm not going to make my next point, but I will say that in addition to helping speed along the process of finding whether or not a traditional amendment approach can succeed, I do applaud your efforts to start charting that uncharted river and provide people a sense of, okay, we know their rocks, we know their sandbars, we know where they are. I think the idea of holding these, faux conventions in a box, or whatever you called them, Larry, is an excellent idea. And I would actually point you to one that just happened in California, that California Common Cause did co-sponsor. It's on a website called www.nextca.org. It was 300 people in Torrance, chosen at random, talking about state constitutional issues, but it did go a long way towards reducing people's fears of what happens if you put 300 regular people off the street in a room and let them talk about stuff that matters. So that's another example to look at. I think it's something that should be replicated in a lot of other places, and it might help allay some of the concerns that are legitimate concerns that people have about this uncharted territory that you want to take us into. Thanks.
Sure.
Oh, it's me?
Yeah.
No, well,
I thought it was. Oh, I thought you said, yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me to be at this conference. I'm probably the only film major speaking here at the conference. I think that Professor Lessig and Mark Meckler have arrived at some conclusions that Annabelle and I share, and I wanted to briefly tell you how we arrived at those conclusions. I live in Prince William County, Virginia, which is the only jurisdiction in the United States to actually implement the Arizona SB 1070 immigration law. We had it on the books for 8 weeks and then repealed it. What happened in our county was that for the period leading up to the 2007 county election, statewide election, the issue suddenly shifted to an invasion of illegal immigrants who had leprosy and were committing heinous crimes. None of this turned out to be true, but it focused the issue in our county on how do we remove these people. And the solution that was brought to us by the same lobbyists from Washington, D.C. who wrote the Arizona law was we required the police to check the immigration status of people who appear to be undocumented. So it created a tremendous culture war that was chilling, it was frightening, because once the language was, we are at war, the only people who were willing to participate were those who thrive on conflict, on both sides of the issue. And so those of us who are more conflict averse sort of abdicated our civic duty to participate in this process. And the result was that a very radical idea and a very small minority of the county was able to push through a policy that ultimately ended up being very costly for us as taxpayers and also for the fabric of our society. So the solution to that, I mean, why did they repeal the law? That is really the thesis of the Coffee Party. They repealed the law because a transpartisan coalition emerged using social media to create a safe haven, a place where people could feel that they could come to participate without the language of war, without being threatened or intimidated. And at first they actually used fake names, but gradually we were able to coax them into, from comments, we had what we called an interactive documentary on YouTube. We were able to coax them from making comments to actually being interviewed and being part of the story. And eventually this YouTube channel became like a virtual French resistance. And when those people agreed to actually come out and meet in person, it really excited members of the Board of Supervisors, mostly Republican, who wanted a way out of this fiscal and public safety and economic mess that they had been forced to create, basically with a knife to their throat right before an election. And so what happened was one Democrat, there's 2 Democrats and 6 Republicans on this board. 1 Democrat and 1 Republican came to the first public meeting of the virtual resistance. It was April 4th, 2008. The law had been in effect for a month. The law was repealed on April 29th, 2008, before the month was over. That's how quickly it happened once the silent majority, the silent and alienated majority, was liberated from that feeling that if we do participate, there will be consequences for us. And so I wanted to relate that to the challenge that we have here, because there is a real danger in disengagement by design, which I think our country as a whole is now facing, where I think that there are certain vested interests that saw a tremendous amount of danger in the demographic shifts that we're going through, the new voters that were coming into our process, the young people who were coming into our process. Okay. And the only way to respond to that was to try to disengage them, to alienate them with language of war, with rhetoric, with misinformation that made us focus on a fight rather than trying to find ways to make progress together. And so what I wanted to begin by saying is I really appreciate that Mark and so many conservatives are here, even though the story is supposed to be that the other side is, people we must defeat, and the only thing we're after is electoral victory or policy victory. I think the leadership that Professor Lessig has shown is crucial to us making progress, because if we are going to fix this cycle of corruption that is plaguing our Congress, the most important thing we need to solve is not just the constitutional and the sort of the legal questions, but also the cultural question that Annabelle mentioned yesterday. How do we bring the silent, alienated majority back into the process? And I think that a series of mock constitutional conventions, a tour like we've been talking about, I think that might be the way to do it. Thank you.
Good morning. I was struck yesterday when somebody asked for a show of hands of who thought the system was broken. And just about, I think only one person did not raise their hand when they said that they didn't think it was broken. So everybody generally thought it was broken. Here's why I think it's broken. I think it's a political truism that it's easier to spend than tax. And because of that, we have a debt in our country that's $15 trillion. I got involved with politics after I read a book called Come Back America by David Walker. Bipartisan in nature. He had served under different administrations. He was, I think, the General Accounting Office. And he laid out why it really is not a Democrat or a Republican matter. It's a structural issue that is plaguing us. Federalist 51 says that if men were angels, we would not need a government. But we are governed by men, and therefore government also needs to have certain levels of control. And states play that key role. I'm excited to be a state legislator. I know that there have been hoots about incumbents, and people that run for office. I think states can do something. And I embarked to try to do something about it. I had 2 bills. I had 14 bills, but 2 of them were Article 5 bills. One of them passed. That was the Balanced Budget Amendment. One of them did not pass. It dealt with federal term limits. It pointed to another political truism, and that is whether you're at the federal level or at the state level, the political class does not like change. They want the status quo to remain. So I think that why Article 5? It shakes things up. It allows us to have a discussion. It's the one chance that may drive Congress to act in a responsible way. I don't know of any other chance. I think we have to try to do it. Which leads us then in this closing panel with what can we do now? And I'm going to make a challenge. People have made an analogy to the federal budget to that Thelma and Louise movie, the last scene, where they're sitting in their car, the engine's revved up, they look behind them, they see the police lights, and then they hit the accelerator and they're off. And in a way, that same argument has been raised against Article 5 conventions. People are afraid that we'll drive off the cliff and we won't know what to do. I'd like to rewrite the movie script. What I'd like to see is, was this an academic exercise, Professor Lessig? I'd like to say no. And it won't be if we do one thing. I'd like this institution of knowledge that can challenge the establishment, that can reason back and forth, and not just this institution, but any of them. And as people together, we come together and we build a parachute for Article 5. We come together and we find out, is there a way? Obviously, Congress won't do it. I was interested, Michael, in your law review, that Congress had a bill, and where did it go? Nowhere, to put together the structure for an Article 5 convention. But we have other systems in place. We have the Uniform Code Commissioner that does uniform laws. We have the National Conference of State Legislators. That's an association. There can be existing groups of people that come together, make it their obligation to build the parachute so that we can know that when we're standing at the abyss and we see all that exposure below us, that we're comfortable that there will be a safe landing. And I think if we do that, the left and the right will be willing to come together and try. I think we need to make Madison proud. I think we need to try.
Well, thanks for having us here. Thanks for letting the Tea Party descend upon Harvard. Probably hasn't been quite as radical as maybe the media hoped we would be, and we're probably not generally as radical as people try to portray us as being. But after being here this weekend, it seems like it's sort of a kumbaya moment, and so I'm going to break up the party a little bit. I hope you don't mind. I think we have some things in common. I think we discovered that. And I think that's important. I think the most important thing that we discovered is that we can get into a room and we can have reasoned conversation and we can prove to the world that we're all Americans first and that we don't hate each other, right? Can we do that together? So I think fundamentally that's the most important thing we can prove, but I also think that we shouldn't try to gloss over our differences. We have very different views of society. We have different views of where we are today. We have different views of how to fix our problems. And I think that it's important that we have these differences. These are the differences and these are the debates that made this nation great. It wasn't because the founders all believed the exact same thing that we came up with a great nation. It's because they had heated debates. They disliked each other, sometimes intensely, and they were willing to fight for what they believed intensely and eventually reach consensus. And that's what they did. So I think the vigorous debate is important. So I'd like to point out a couple of places where I think that we do disagree. We all saw what I considered honestly one of the best speeches I've ever seen last night from Lawrence Lessig. Was that amazing? I mean, really, in presentation, in substance, really extraordinary. I mean, I sat back there in awe thinking, someday I'm going to grow up and be able to speak like that. not to mention the PowerPoint presentation. But I have a fundamental disagreement with what I saw. And Larry identified what he believes is the root cause of the problem and stated that the root cause of the problem essentially is the influence of money in politics. And I think he did find some of the roots, but I think he found the surface roots. There's a taproot that runs much deeper. And unless you address the taproot, you'll never fix the problem, in my opinion. And the taproot is, there is a reason there is so much money in politics. That's because there is so much money in government. There is so much power in government. People spend money to buy politicians because our government is so huge and has so much control over our lives. Our government has grown beyond the wildest imagination of the founders to invade every aspect of our lives. At the federal level, at the state level, at the municipal level, there is so much influence to buy. There is so much regulation to control. There are so many officials who need to be bought off with campaign money. The bottom line, the taproot of this problem is the size and scope of government in the lives of Americans today. And if we were to shrink government, if we were to put it back in the box that the founders intended, it wouldn't be so darn profitable to spend so much money to buy elections. And I think that's a fundamental distinction that people on the right would make from people on the left, that there is a deeper root cause. And I would posit that that is a fundamental difference that we need to discuss. What is the proper size and scope of government? Because until we have that debate, until we decide, do we need to put this back in the box, and I would argue vociferously, we do need to put it back in the box, we can try to take money out of politics all we want, but money is like water. It will find its way in through the smallest crack. It will find its way in under the door, under the windowsill, through the vents. It will always find its way in unless we remove government's control over our lives. So thank you guys for having us here.
It has been an extraordinary event, and I'm going to try to wrap it up with a little bit more kumbaya-ism than Mark wanted to suggest. First, very practically, there are many people out of this event who say, I want to learn more, and I want to know what more we can do. Callaconvention.org is the place you can be brought into this conversation. Callaconvention.org. And callaconvention.org is right now the beginnings of an organization. I swore that I would never launch another organization again, and I'm trying to find the person to help it so I don't have to launch such an organization. But I want this organization to help seed the mock convention project that we spoke of. And the California example is perfect. Jim Fishkin, who invented deliberative polls, did the California project, and it's exactly that kind of project that I want to see mirrored throughout the country. So if you're interested, that's the place to go. Second point, for those who want to try to make this happen, we have got to recognize the only potential that we've got to facilitate a convention is if people of different political views build compatible movements towards the convention. So there's been enormous success on the debt call convention. And we need to recognize that unless we can have these successes complement each other, so that at the end of the day, Congress has no choice but to say, we have 34 calls from 34 states. And they are sufficiently compatible to say, we must do something, we won't see Congress do anything. So I think there's strategic obligation for those of us who believe this is essential, is the obligation to make sure that we work together to get to a place where we can talk about how to fix this republic without believing we're going to resolve the question before we get to that place. There is lots that we need to work through, but we work through in the right context. And in the organizing space, I don't think we're at that right context. Number 3, the root or the taproot. The root or the taproot. So I was on a talk show with a Glenn Beck wannabe in Colorado. And I laid out the story, and he said, "You're missing the whole point. If we only had a flat tax, we would eliminate all the problems that we've got." And I said, I'm willing to entertain the idea that a flat tax solves the problem, just like I'm willing to entertain the idea that a smaller government solves the problem. But we have to recognize the existing problem, the root that I was talking about, guarantees we will have no flat tax. It guarantees we'll have no smaller government, because a flat tax and a smaller government is antithetical to the project of raising money to get back into Congress. So I want a world where you have a fair shot at your argument for a smaller government. And I want a world where that guy has a fair shot at an argument for a flat tax. And I want a world where we have an opportunity on the left to achieve reform that we want to achieve without being blocked by special interests in the middle. I want a world where there is the opportunity for disagreement to play fair and have the struggles, the really very intense arguments, and then when the people say one way or another, the government actually reflect it. I don't think we're going to get to that world. And the best evidence, I suggest, is a fantastic book by Robert Kaiser, So Damn Much Money. If you look at the title, if you look at the chapters in my book, you'll see it goes through 4 or 5 chapters, which is sort of a play on his book, So Damn Much Money. But he tells the story of the Gingrich Revolution. In the Gingrich Revolution, all these guys go to Washington with the idea of shrinking the size of government. He reports on this extraordinary event where the Gingrich people sit down and they say, you know, the problem with shrinking the size of government, it's going to be really hard to raise the money. We need to keep control of Congress. So we need to keep control of Congress for a couple more cycles before we get around to our problem of shrinking the size of government. Now, you guys may have perfected the machine that makes it possible to hold them to what they promised. I don't know. I'm not yet convinced that's going to happen, but maybe. But I think the really important step would be if you helped us make it possible for both the left and the right to have a fair shot at getting a democracy to reflect what they believe in. But here's the final point. There's hope and there's hopelessness here. There's hope to look at it as size of this room with the number of people here thinking seriously and listening carefully about these issues and trying to work through what makes sense and what we should do. But there's hopelessness that Mark and I experienced this morning. We were invited to Chris Hayes' Up show, which is Up. It's a new show. It's from 7 to 9 on Saturdays and Sundays on MSNBC. And so we each are told to go into our separate television rooms, and we have our separate earphones on. And Chris begins. Chris is brilliant. I love him. He begins with some serious questions to both Mark and me. And then we don't even know who these people are in the room, start asking us questions. The first question goes to Mark was, so did you actually listen to people at that conference, or did you just bloviate in front of everyone? And the next question from somebody else was, so who funded that conference? How exactly did you get to be at that place? And I think both of us had this sinking recognition that there's no opportunity in that space to begin to have the conversation that we're having here. And if we live in a political culture where that's where political conversation happens, and not in places like this, what's our hope? How are we ever going to get someplace? So if there's anything you take out from this, it might not be joining callaconvention.org. It might not be helping us to do mock conventions. It might not be striking at the root. At least participate in movements that insist that citizens need to rediscover the ability to self-regulate by actually framing conversations and debates and discussions according to the ethic of deliberation that makes understanding and democracy possible. We don't have that now. We don't have that now as a nation. And I am more honored at the end of this convention than I was at the beginning to be able to begin to try to build that with people of the character and integrity, however much as I disagree with his particular politics, but the character and integrity of Meckler and Bill Norton and others who have come from the Tea Party to help facilitate this. So I will take I shouldn't say bad, nasty words, so I will take SHIT for this statement from all sorts of people, but we've done something, I think, and I thank you for helping us to do it.
I agree with some of what both Mark and Larry said, some of it. I'm neither a progressive nor a conservative. I'm a populist. I came from the left. In the 1960s, I was a community organizer in the civil rights movement and in SDS. I believed then in the ideal of participatory democracy, and that's still what I believe in. However, in recent years, my compatriots have been mostly on the right. In 1994, I published a small book whose subtitle was A Constitutional Populist Manifesto, and was in a place where I wanted to take my ideas and put them into practice. And what I found, luckily, was the movement already underway to amend the Constitution via the traditional route, to undo the Supreme Court's decisions with respect to physical desecration of the flag, restoring to Congress the power to punish physical desecration of the flag. This was a perfect cause for me as a populist because 70% of the American people, men and women just the same, whites and non-whites just the same, supported such amendment in poll after poll after poll, and they still do. Okay? I worked with an organization called the Citizens Flag Alliance, and I'm now the national chairman 17 years later of the organization. I have more experience with U.S. constitutional amendment than anyone in my line of work. And so let me tell you what I learned and what I take from it moving forward. Mainly what I learned is that the resistance to what is seen as the intrusion of democratic politics into constitutional law is extraordinarily powerful. Okay? We came within one vote, finally, in 2006 in the Senate. We'd gotten 2/3 many times in the House. We got 66, but not 67 votes. And I watched the powers at work. It was not, frankly, the power of money. No, it was the power of a cultural power, an ideological power, a power that produced process arguments, invoking fear, slippery slope fears, but more importantly, fears based in loathing of ordinary people. Prejudice, rank prejudice against ordinary people. And so the opponents of this amendment, which had such remarkable supermajority support among ordinary people, both exaggerated its effect and trivialized it at the same time. And they were very effective. Now, what is this power? As I've said, I do not believe it's money. I would call it the governmental academic media complex. Okay? And it is an ideological force devoted to keeping ordinary people, which is to say democracy and majority rule, out of constitutional law. Like animals fighting for their territory, this group that I call not so much the political class, but the governing class, will try to keep others out. Our job, whatever we label ourselves, is to defeat them. Now, that's not very kumbaya, but I think this is a matter of attack and defeat because they're so powerful. The governing class is defined by something that you all may not want to hear, and that's education. Most people in this room, I would expect, are well educated. Ask yourself, do you loathe people who are not? Do you fear them? And in the back of your mind somewhere, you may be able to tune into those feelings, which are the ones that fuel the governing class in this country. So I have 3 suggestions. First, for the future, our country has a terrific problem of distrust of collective behavior called government. We all know that. Okay? The mass of Americans have come to loathe the governing class as much as the governing class loathes them. And that gives us power. Okay? We have to turn that power on in efforts to take democratic politics to and into constitutional law in every way possible. That's the first point. Secondly, I don't think it matters how we do it. Or to put it another way, what matters is that we do it in every way possible. Here I agree with Larry. Okay? The traditional amendment route, the convention route, the route of encouraging legislatures at the national and state level simply to defy the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says such and such is unconstitutional. Do it again. Do it again. Do it again. Do it again. Okay? And also making constitutional law via initiative and referendum at the state level. Those are 4 ways in which democratic politics can break through this barrier that the governing class has set up. And finally, my third point is that it's very important, not that we support one another's specific cause, whether it's the balanced budget, right, or some prayer amendment or the flag amendment, but that we support one another in attacking members of the governing class who make these process arguments based on fear and loathing of ordinary people and thus democracy. If we can unite on that, we will have achieved a great deal. And my understanding is that that is an underlying mood in this group, which makes this a very important moment. Now, my hope is now that first members of the panel will feel in a somewhat critical mood vis-a-vis one another, and if they're not, I'm sure there are people in the audience who are, to get a discussion going.
Oh, you want to go straight to Should I?
You want?
Okay. Yeah, I want to pose what I think is a pretty difficult question to any of the proponents of a convention. Larry can take it, or others. I have my own answer to this, but curious as to what others say. The argument I hear a lot is, how can we realistically expect state legislators to propose and call for a constitutional convention when, even though they may be closer to the people, they are still elected by the same big money that elects Congress. And in fact, even to this day, less than half of state legislators have taken the step of banning CEOs from using their shareholders' and customers' money to making a direct contribution to candidates, which even under today's Supreme Court bizarre jurisprudence, they could do. So if we don't have the lever to move even that, why do we think we have a lever that can move what to many seems like a much heavier lift?
So my answer would be, my answer is that it's easier, it's not easy, to fight the battle to get states to pass a resolution to support a convention than it is to get 67 votes for the kind of reform you and I want in the United States Senate. I mean, 66 votes for flag-burning amendment, I understand. I understand how that's plausible, but 50 votes for what you and I want is not plausible in the United States Senate. So it's easier, not easy. It's easier first because as organizations like Move to Amend, imagine Move to Amend starts pushing this, and they go to one state and they convince one state to pass the call for a convention for this purpose. that is an organizational moment for celebration. We achieved one victory in this state. Let's go to the next state, and then the next state, and the next state. And it begins to be a way of organizing movement that has tickers of success that can then fuel further success. The fight in the United States Senate is in a fight that will have no moments of success. There's nothing to point to say, geez, we've achieved something, because you're not going to achieve anything. It's not going to go anywhere. And it's easier also because I agree money is everywhere in our political system, but it's not everywhere perfectly efficiently in our political system, right? They're really good at controlling within 495, the Beltway. They're very good at that. I get it. Not on all issues. They don't care about certain issues. That's, I think I completely agree with Richard about the lack of money being the real issue in a context like the flag burning amendment. But in the issues I care about and you care about, money is the issue. They're very good at fighting inside the Beltway. They're not so great in fighting in Montana or in Utah. You know, it's not as comfortable to go to Montana or to North Dakota and fight these battles in those places. There aren't great hotels the way that there are in, you know, they're fine hotels, there's fine, but it's not the kind of, you know, luxury location that they like to hang out at. The lobbyists, the high-priced lobbyists, are not going to go to Montana. That's just not where they're going to spend their time. So I think there's a real opportunity. And it depends on the issue you pick. Again, if we build a series of compatible calls for a convention, then in Montana, let them fight about balanced budget. And in, in Wyoming, let them fight about line item veto. That's fine. You know, they can win in those states on those particular issues. But let's just fight in a compatible way so that eventually we get close to 34, or at least get 30, so that it produces enough terror inside the system that they begin to respond to we the people. Because I am, with Richard, I am a populist. And I am with Ralph Banco. I am a populist. And that's why I said last night that people who fight this movement on the grounds that we the people shouldn't have a role in constitutional law are, I think, completely misguided. So I want to find a way to facilitate that populist movement.
I'd like to posit a question. I think most people that I've talked to here are of the fundamental belief that, for the most part, the Supreme Court isn't currently following the real meaning of the Constitution. The Congress isn't following the meaning of the Constitution. So what's the magic, where's the pixie dust in the new amendments that make us believe that if we're imposing things on them that they don't want, and you're saying money is the root of all of this, so why are they going to follow the new magic amendment or amendments?
So you're right, they can stretch, but there are certain things they couldn't stretch against. So Richard's amendments to facilitate, you know, the regulation of flag desecration. They couldn't fight against that. You know, they could find ways, but they couldn't fight against it. And I think properly framed amendments, you know,
so they won't find penumbral flag burning?
They will try. People will try, no doubt. But there are just certain things that it's just too hard to do. So if there were a line item veto amendment, you know, those, like we have this fight in Wisconsin about what in fact a line item veto means, and you know, but they just can't go too far. And so if you say, if you have a well-structured amendment that authorizes the kind of thing that I care about to not silence speech, right? My solution is not about saying certain people can't speak or certain corporations can't participate. If we had such a structured amendment, I think there's edges that they can fight around, but they couldn't get at the core.
I have three answers. First, at the state level, you have more representative democracy. In Montana, we have 2 U.S. senators and 1 U.S. congressman. We have 150 legislators. Now, I don't know how your states stack up, but I spoke to somebody from Vermont. He was a town selectman, 650 people in the town, and there were 3 selectmen. I think that there's going to be representative government that's closer to the people. The second thing is states have experience with our state constitutions. In Montana, we had our first constitution in 1889 upon statehood, and then in 1972 we wrote a new constitution. It was grueling, it was tough, it almost was overturned, it had to be ratified. But in that constitution, they said that we want the people of Montana to be able to take a renewed look every 10 years to see if they want to have another constitutional convention. Every 10 years. We just had that election in 2010 and people said no. people in the states at the state level understand constitutional governance, I think, better because it's not the first date. I forget what speaker brought that up, that it's the first date. The third reason is this. It's because what Article 5 says. And I think the framers were masterful. They were well thought out reasons as to how can we allow the steam pot to sometimes release some steam and change this system as it goes along. So that's why I'm a big fan of Article 5, those three reasons.
I guess I'd give a different answer to Mark's question, a non-law prof and non-legislative answer, which would be however we would arrive at amendment, whether it be a traditional process or a convention process, it would require a significant political movement in this country that would be irrefutable. And yeah, at the end of the day, the Constitution and any amendment to it is a piece of paper that's only as good as our collective will to enforce it. We saw after the 13th and 14th Amendment, we lost some of that collective will in the South, and we had pieces of paper that did not protect black people in the South until a civil rights movement came up 100 years later. So I don't have faith in the text of whatever we're going to get into here. I have faith in the movement that we will have to build to accomplish that change in piece of paper, and we're going to have to keep that and not just assume that that textual change will protect us for the next 100 years.
And I mean, let's imagine that it could start with the people, that it didn't require a media empire to start a movement, it didn't require a politician or a political party to start a movement. Let's just start, at the real root, which should be the real root, with the people, and let's just think about what it would look like. Annabelle and I travel around the country speaking to college students. That's the only income that we have. Because Coffee Party and all the stuff we do that's in any way political is as a volunteer. And when we talk to students, a lot of times members of the Coffee Party will come to the events or we'll create separate events. We have one today at 4 o'clock at, oh, never mind, I can't read the handwriting. Sorry. Sorry, Annabelle. 286 Franklin Street is the address. What's the name of the place, Annabelle? Oh, okay, Central Square, Cambridge, okay. But I think what it looks like is, and I mentioned some things that were threatening to sort of the ruling class, the demographic shifts that we're going through, but another huge revolutionary change we're going through is the social media revolution. As people migrate from their cable television shows to an arena where we have completely democratized the flow of information so that you don't actually have to own a very expensive communication tool in order to have a voice, and that people become producers of content and not just consumers. And so what we're finding is in those digital natives, those young people that we talk to, there is the potential to create the kind of movement that would be an irresistible force. So that when the people are, I love this select at random. We'll start with a select at random for the mock constitutional conventions. And Annabelle and I plan to spend the next year, we're starting a citizens intervention October 29th at the US Capitol. And it's the beginning of a year of meetings around the country, which are basically mock constitutional conventions, free speech, open mic for people to propose changes. Because we tried this at the Coffee Party convention with Larry and Mark McKinnon, having a mock constitutional convention. And at that time, it felt like it was really impossible to get people to focus on anything other than the policy fight they want to win or the election fight they want to win. They saw that the dysfunction in Washington is completely separate from the suffering in their own lives. But in 2011, some things have really changed. We began to see how the dysfunction in Washington has a direct influence on the economy and on the recovery that we had going into the summer that we may not have coming out of the summer. And so I think that the people are ready to start to focus on these larger systemic issues, and I believe it is corruption that is the problem. It's not the body, it's the cancer within the body. If we want to destroy the body in response to the cancer, we're not going to be left with anything. So I think that what we need to do is try to resurrect the patient. We need to treat the patient, because the government is us. We the people, we are the government. And that's the... If we dismantle that, then that really, the United States government is the strongest democracy in the world, and it's the only barrier to complete control of these corporations that have become so powerful that they're challenging the sovereignty of our government, the people.
Chris wanted to say something, and then we'll see if others in the room want to speak.
Yeah, I think the most important point I'm taking away from what's just been said is I think it's important to compare two separate movements that are happening here and how they're different. One is the national popular vote movement, which is an agreement among the states. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And why it's different from this is that I think there can be some, with the national popular vote movement, because it's an agreement between the states that carves out any interaction with Congress, you can have an incremental approach over time that once you meet a certain number of electoral votes, it kicks into gear, and it can take a period of time. I think that there's a difference here, and the difference is that you need a broad and intense movement, because I think the way that Article 5 is written, Congress can act in various ways to avoid having to call it unless there's a broad and intense movement that requires them to act. I don't think if you had, say, 30 years of people calling for a constitutional convention on an issue without a broad and intense national movement, I think that the various ways that you can avoid calling it at the congressional level are more likely to be used than if it is intense over a shorter period of time and it's national.